somewhere along the banks of the Nile, beneath a sky that had witnessed the rise and fall of 100 dynasties, a scribe sat in the flicker of oil lamplight and dipped his reed brush into ink the color of midnight. His hands moved with deliberate care, not the hurried hand of a man writing a letter or tallying grain or recording a tax. No, this man was writing instructions for the dead. He was composing a map, not a map of roads or rivers or the known corners of the earth, but a map of what waited on the other side of everything, a guide through the darkness that swallowed each human life at its end, and a set of tools, words and spells powerful enough, if the ancients are to be believed, to carry a soul safely through it. We call it the Book of the Dead. The Egyptians had a different name for it. They called it Ro Nu Pert Em Her, the chapters of coming forth by day. That single phrase tells you everything about how the Egyptians understood death. It was not an ending, it was a departure, a journey undertaken at the close of one kind of existence and the beginning of another. A passage through a vast and treacherous underworld, full of serpents, locked gates, and divine judges, toward something the Egyptians believed in with the wholeness of their civilization, rebirth into eternal light. The Book of the Dead was their manual for making that crossing for nearly 1,500 years, from roughly 1550 BCE, stretching well into the 1st century of the Common Era. This collection of spells, hymns, and illustrated instructions was placed in the tombs of kings, nobles, priests, merchants, and, in time, ordinary people who could save enough to afford a copy. Some versions were painted in vivid color on papyrus scrolls, more than 20 meters long. Others were inscribed in careful hieroglyphs on the linen wrappings of the mummified body itself, or carved into the inner walls of coffins, or written on small clay figures buried alongside the dead. The medium changed. The purpose never did. It was protection. It was preparation. It was the most important document a person could own, not for this life, but for whatever came next. And what it described was extraordinary. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider following our show as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. The soul, according to ancient Egyptian belief, did not simply depart peacefully at death. It faced a harrowing ordeal. It had to navigate the duat, the underworld, a realm of shadow and fire populated by monstrous guardians who blocked each of the 12 gates. A soul must pass through during the 12 hours of night. It had to know the secret name of every gatekeeper. It had to recite the correct incantations at every threshold, or be turned back, or worse, consumed in the darkness. And then, at the journey's end, came the moment the Egyptians called the weighing of the heart. It is perhaps the most hauntingly beautiful concept in all of human religious history. The dead soul was led into a great hall presided over by Osiris, god of the underworld. There, before 42 divine judges, one for each of Egypt's regions, the deceased recited what scholars call the negative confession, a declaration of all the wrongs they had not committed in life. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused suffering to others. Then the heart. The Egyptians believed the heart held the entire moral record of a life, was placed upon a golden scale. Opposite it was placed a single feather, the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul passed into paradise, the field of reeds, a blessed realm described as an idealized Egypt, lush and golden, where the dead lived in abundance and peace for eternity. If the heart was heavier, weighted down by sin, by cruelty, by dishonesty, a creature waited beside the scale. The Egyptians called it Amit, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile. It would devour the heart, and that soul would cease to exist entirely. Not hell, not punishment, annihilation. The Book of the Dead was written to prevent that fate. Within its chapters, 192, in the most complete versions we have found, there are spells to protect the body from decay. There are hymns to the sun god Ra, spoken as the soul traveled through the night alongside his great solar bark. There are instructions for breathing underwater. There are words of power to open locks that no human hand could touch. There is, remarkably, a spell to prevent a man from being turned upside down while eating in the afterlife, because even paradise had its indignities to guard against. There is poetry, there is terror. There is, woven through every line, a civilization's most intimate and furious insistence that death was not the end. Over the course of this documentary, we will walk through that world, chapter by chapter, image by image, and meet the gods, the monsters, and the souls who populated the most extraordinary guide to the afterlife ever written. The journey begins, as all Egyptian journeys did, at the edge of the river, at the threshold of the known world, and just beyond it, the dark. There is a question that haunts every scholar who has ever unrolled a papyrus scroll and read the ancient words written there. A question deceptively simple, and yet almost impossible to fully answer. Where did the Book of the Dead come from? The easy answer is Egypt. But Egypt, as a civilization, spans a period of time so vast that the word origin becomes almost meaningless without a great deal of careful unwinding. Because the Book of the Dead, as we know it, that great illustrated collection of spells placed in tombs during the New Kingdom period, beginning around 1550 BCE, was not born fully formed. It did not arrive in the world the way a single author's work arrives. It grew, it accumulated. It gathered itself over centuries, pulling from older traditions the way a river gathers tributaries, until it became something enormous and deep and almost beyond the reach of any single person's full comprehension. To find its true beginning, we have to go back further, much further. We have to go back to the pyramids, long before the Book of the Dead existed in the form most people recognize. Those vivid illustrated scrolls with their golden vignettes of gods and scales and feathered hearts. The walls of Egyptian pyramid chambers were already covered in text, densely packed columns of hieroglyphs inscribed with extraordinary care into the stone itself, filling every available surface of the burial chambers and corridors within the great pyramids of the Old Kingdom. These are the pyramid texts, and they are the oldest religious corpus in human history. The oldest among them date to approximately 2000 BCE, roughly 4,400 years before anyone alive today was born. They were written exclusively for kings. In the worldview of the Old Kingdom, only a pharaoh had a soul complex enough, a divine status elevated enough to require such elaborate textual protection in death. The common people, it was understood, simply died. The king transformed. The pyramid texts are concerned with that transformation. They describe the pharaoh's soul rising to join the gods among the circumpolar stars, the stars that never set, that wheel eternally around the northern sky without ever dipping below the horizon. For the Egyptians, those stars were the souls of the glorified dead, the Ark, the blessed, the luminous ones. The king's goal was to join them. The texts guided him there. They are strange and beautiful, and occasionally very difficult to interpret, even now. Some passages feel ancient, even by Egyptian standards, as though the priests who inscribed them were themselves working from traditions they only partially understood, copying formulas whose origins were already lost to living memory. Scholars believe that some of the pyramid texts may preserve religious ideas from Egypt's earliest pre-dynastic period, before writing itself had fully developed. Oral traditions so old they predate the civilization that eventually wrote them down. That idea, that these words are older than the act of writing them, is one of the most arresting things about the entire tradition. Several centuries passed. Egypt changed, as Egypt always did, in cycles of stability and upheaval. The Old Kingdom fell into a period of fragmentation. Power shifted, the exclusive privilege of the elaborate textual afterlife, once the sole property of kings, began, slowly and then with gathering momentum, to spread outward. By the period Egyptologists call the Middle Kingdom, beginning around 2055 BCE, a new body of mortuary literature had emerged. These are called the coffin texts, and their name tells you precisely where they were found, inscribed on the interior surfaces of wooden coffins belonging not only to royalty, but to members of the provincial elite, high officials, regional governors, wealthy priests, successful merchants. This was a profound shift. Death, or rather the hope of a blessed afterlife, was becoming democratized. The magical protection that had once been the exclusive inheritance of the divine king was beginning to reach downward through the social structure, touching those who had the wealth and influence to commission coffins elaborate enough to contain it. The coffin texts borrowed extensively from the pyramid texts, but they also added new material, new spells, new vignettes, new approaches to the problem of guiding a soul through the underworld. They introduced some ideas that would become foundational to everything that followed: the concept of the field of reeds as the paradise destination of the righteous dead, a deeper engagement with the mythology of Osiris, and an increasingly detailed and dramatic vision of the underworld itself, its gates, its guardians, its dangers, and the spells required to navigate them. The coffin texts are, in a very real sense, the direct ancestors of the Book of the Dead. The family resemblance is unmistakable. Read them side by side, and you can see the lineage clearly. The same concerns, the same destinations, the same fundamental anxiety about what awaits in the darkness, and the same fierce insistence that the right words, spoken at the right moment, carry a power equal to any monster the underworld might place in a soul's path. And then came the New Kingdom, around 1550 BCE, following the expulsion of a foreign ruling group known as the Hyksos and the reunification of Egypt under a new and enormously energetic dynasty. Something changed in the way Egyptians prepared their dead. The mortuary tradition, already rich and complex, underwent a transformation in both form and reach. The texts migrated from coffin walls to papyrus. The format became more standardized, not rigidly so, for individual scrolls still varied enormously in their selection of chapters, their quality of illustration, and the particularity of their decoration. But a recognizable body of material began to coalesce, a kind of canon of essential spells and passages that most versions of the guide would include. Illustrations became increasingly central, not decorative additions, but integral components of the text itself, with specific vignettes assigned to specific chapters and painted with a skill and vividness that still astonishes museum visitors today. And, perhaps most significantly of all, the reach of this tradition continued its long democratic expansion. The Book of the Dead was not only for kings, it was not only for the elite. By the later periods of Egyptian history, it had become available to any family with enough resources to commission or purchase a copy. Scribes and artists produced them in something approaching a workshop system, with certain sections pre-written and spaces left blank for the name of whoever ultimately purchased the scroll to be inserted. Ready-made afterlife guides, waiting for their owner. There is something deeply human about that detail. The idea that a family would save and plan and eventually walk into a scribe's workshop and say, in essence, we want to make sure our loved one has everything they need for what comes next. That the words mattered so much, that the correct spells, the right illustrations, the proper recitations were considered as essential to a good death as anything that had been done in life. The man most closely associated with organizing the Book of the Dead into the standardized form scholars study today is a high priest and scribe named Ani, though it would be more accurate to say that we know the Book of the Dead most intimately through his copy. The Papyrus of Ani, dating to around 175 BCE and now housed in the British Museum in London, is one of the longest, most beautifully illustrated and best preserved examples ever discovered. At nearly 24 meters in length, it contains 72 chapters and some of the most exquisite painted vignettes in all of ancient Egyptian art. When Egyptologists in the 19th century first began systematically studying and translating these texts, it was largely through the Papyrus of Ani and similar scrolls that the structure of the Book of the Dead became legible to the modern world. The scholar E.A. Parr Wallace Budge, whose translations remain controversial in some scholarly circles for their interpretive choices, but whose work nonetheless brought these texts to a vast popular audience, published his famous edition in 1895. And for the first time, readers in London and Paris and New York could sit quietly in their homes and read the words that Egyptian priests had once whispered over the wrapped and silent bodies of the dead. That moment of contact between a tradition 4,000 years old and the modern reader encountering it for the first time tends to produce a very particular sensation, not the detached interest of examining an artifact from a safely distant past. Something closer, stranger, and more unsettling than that. The recognition that the questions these words were written to answer. What happens to us? Is there something waiting on the other side? Will we be judged? And by what measure? Can we be saved? Are not old questions. They are the same questions being asked right now by every living human being who has ever stood at a graveside and looked up at the sky. The Egyptians simply believed they had the answers, and they wrote them down. There is something remarkable about the human impulse to draw a map, long before we had the tools to measure coastlines accurately, or calculate the curvature of the earth, or send instruments into the sky to photograph the shape of continents from above. We were drawing maps, scratching them into clay, painting them onto cave walls, carving them into bone. The map is one of the oldest expressions of a particular kind of human courage, the refusal to accept that any territory, however dark or dangerous or unknown, is beyond the possibility of being understood. The ancient Egyptians mapped the underworld, not as metaphor, not as poetry, though their descriptions were often both. They mapped it with the seriousness and the systematic attention of people who genuinely believed they were recording real geography. A realm as actual, as traversable, as measurable in its own way as the Nile Delta or the Eastern Desert. They gave it regions and districts, they named its rivers, they described its gates with enough architectural specificity that you could, reading their texts, almost believe you might one day stand before one and recognize it. This place, the realm through which every soul must travel after death, they called the Duat. And understanding what the Egyptians believed the Duat to be is essential to understanding everything the Book of the Dead was written to accomplish. Because the spells are not abstract, they are not philosophical meditations dressed in symbolic language. They are, in the Egyptian understanding, practical instructions for a real journey through a real place. The difference between a soul that carried these words and a soul that did not was, to the Egyptian mind, precisely the difference between a traveler who sets out across the desert with a map, a full water skin, and knowledge of every well along the route, and one who walks into that same desert with nothing at all. The Duat existed in a relationship with the physical world that was characteristically Egyptian in its layered complexity. It was not simply located somewhere far away, in some remote spiritual dimension, entirely disconnected from the living earth. The Egyptians conceived of it as occupying the space beneath the earth, beneath the ground on which the living walked, beneath the bed of the Nile itself. When the sun set each evening and disappeared below the western horizon, it was understood to be entering the Duat, beginning its nightly journey through the underworld in the great solar bark, fighting its way through darkness and danger before emerging reborn on the eastern horizon at dawn. This is why the west was the direction of death in Egyptian thought. Tombs were built on the western banks of the Nile. The dead traveled westward. To go west was to follow the sun into the underworld, to participate in the same cycle of descent and return that the Egyptians watched play out every single day of their lives in the sky above them. The night, in this conception, was not simply the absence of daylight. It was a journey, and the dead traveled it alongside the sun. The duat was divided into 12 regions, one for each hour of the night. The soul of the deceased, guided by the spells of the Book of the Dead, moved through each of these regions in sequence, passing from the first hour of night to the 12th, shadowing the path of the solar bark as it carried Ra through the darkness toward dawn. Each region had its own character, its own population of divine and semi-divine beings, its own particular dangers. Some regions were described as vast, dark plains, others as corridors of fire. One was a great river, the Werness, which the soul had to cross by ferry, guided by a boatman who would only take passengers who knew the correct words to speak. Another region contained a lake of fire that destroyed the wicked but, paradoxically, refreshed and purified the souls of the righteous, those whose hearts had been found pure on the scales of Ma'at. There were fields in the Duat as well, the field of reeds, the field of offerings, regions of extraordinary beauty and abundance where the blessed dead could live and work and rest in something that the Egyptians imagined as a perfected version of the life they had known along the Nile. There were crops that grew taller than any earthly crop. There was water that never ran dry. There was light, not the harsh light of the desert sun, but something gentler, more diffuse, the eternal soft light of a world from which all suffering had been removed. But to reach those fields, the soul had to survive everything that came before them. The gates were perhaps the most elaborately described feature of the Duat's architecture. The Book of the Dead devotes considerable attention to them, their appearance, their guardians, and most critically, the words that must be spoken before each one would open. In some versions of the text, there are 7 gates. In others, 21. In the most expansive reckonings, there are 42, one for each of the divine judges before whom the soul would eventually stand. Each gate was guarded by a deity whose name was itself a kind of riddle, a compressed description of their function and their power. Names like he who dances in blood, or she whose face is turned backward, or the one who swallows shadows. These were not names chosen for dramatic effect alone. In Egyptian thought, to know the true name of a being was to hold power over it. The soul that could speak the gatekeeper's name with confidence, with the authority of one who genuinely knew, not the desperation of one guessing, was a soul that could pass. This is why the spells of the Book of the Dead contained so many names, not as lists to be memorized in some abstract scholarly sense, but as passwords, as keys, as proof that the soul approaching the gate had been properly prepared. The scroll buried with the body was the preparation. The knowledge it contained was the armor. The guardians themselves deserve a moment of attention, because the Egyptian imagination, when it came to populating the underworld with threatening figures, was working at the very edge of its considerable creative power. There were serpents of extraordinary size, ancient even by Egyptian standards, creatures from a time before the gods had fully ordered the universe, carrying a chaos in them that the current world had supposedly left behind. The most famous of these was Apep, also known as Apophis, a serpent so vast its body filled entire corridors of the underworld, so ancient that it predated the concept of light itself. Every night, as Ra's solar barque traveled through the Duat, Apep attacked it. Every night, the gods aboard the barque fought him back. The outcome was never assured in advance. It was simply that, so far, they had always won, which was why, each morning, the sun continued to rise. There were also beings that were neither fully divine nor fully monstrous, composite figures that blended animal and human characteristics in combinations that spoke to something ancient and deeply uncomfortable in the human psyche. Crocodile heads on human bodies, falcon heads on serpents, figures with multiple arms or no head at all, or a head that faced in two directions simultaneously. The Book of the Dead's illustrated papyri render these beings in careful, vivid color, and there is something in their depiction that goes beyond the decorative. They were meant to convey, through image as much as text, the genuine strangeness of the place the soul was entering. The Duat was not simply dangerous, in the way a desert or a hostile army was dangerous. It was fundamentally alien, a realm governed by rules that did not apply in the world of the living, populated by beings that could not be reasoned with through ordinary human means. Only the right words worked. Only the prepared soul could navigate it. What strikes the modern reader, sitting with these descriptions and turning them over slowly, is the extraordinary coherence of the vision. This was not a folklore tradition of vague ghost stories and half-remembered superstitions. It was a fully realized cosmology, a detailed, internally consistent account of what the universe looked like beyond the boundary of death, constructed and refined over a period of time longer than the entire history of Western civilization from Rome to the present day. The Egyptians did not face the unknown with silence. They faced it with architecture, with geography, with names and gates and ferry crossings and fields of golden grain stretching to a horizon lit by a light that never dimmed. They built a world on the other side, and then they wrote down exactly how to reach it. We tend to think of the soul as a single thing. In most traditions familiar to the modern world, the soul is understood as a unified essence, the irreducible core of a person, the part that persists when the body falls away, the thing that is either saved or lost, rewarded or condemned as one indivisible whole. You have a soul. It is yours. It goes where it goes when you die, and it goes there as one piece. The ancient Egyptians thought about this very differently. To the Egyptian mind, the human being was not a single soul inhabiting a body. It was a complex, layered assembly of distinct spiritual components, each one real, each one with its own name and its own nature, each one with its own particular role to play both in life and in the enormous drama of what followed death. The Book of the Dead was written with this complexity as its foundation, to understand why the text does what it does, why it contains the specific spells it contains, why it concerns itself with the body as much as with the spirit, why the preservation of the physical form through mummification was not merely a cultural custom, but a theological necessity. You have to first understand what the Egyptians believed a human being actually was, and the answer is considerably more intricate than most people expect. The first, and perhaps most fundamental of these components, was the ka. The ka is often translated, somewhat inadequately, as the life force, the vital energy that animated a person during their earthly existence, the invisible double that accompanied every human being from the moment of birth. Egyptian art frequently depicted the ka as a figure identical in appearance to the person it belonged to, rendered in profile beside them like a silent twin, a spiritual mirror image. The Ka did not die when the body died, but it had specific and demanding requirements for its continued existence. It needed a physical anchor, something it could return to, inhabit, recognize as home. Ideally, that anchor was the preserved body itself, which is one of the deepest reasons mummification was so essential to Egyptian mortuary practice. The elaborate, costly, time-consuming process of preserving the body was not vanity. It was not mere sentiment about physical appearance. It was the maintenance of a dwelling place for the car, because a car without an anchor was a car adrift, and a car adrift could not survive. This is also why Egyptian tombs contain statues of the deceased, sometimes dozens of them, of varying sizes and materials. If the worst happened and the mummified body was destroyed or damaged beyond recognition, the car needed an alternative. The statue could serve. The image could function as a home. And this is why the desecration of a tomb, the deliberate destruction of the body or its images, was considered in Egypt not merely a crime against property or against the memory of the dead, but something closer to murder, a second death, the annihilation of a soul that was still, in its own way, alive. Alongside the car existed the bar. If the car was the life force, the bar was something closer to what we might think of as personality, the unique, individual essence of a person, the sum of everything that made them distinctly themselves, rather than anyone else. Egyptian artists depicted the bar as a human-headed bird, usually a falcon or a hawk, with the face carefully rendered to resemble the specific individual it represented. It is one of the most recognizable and distinctive images in all of Egyptian iconography. That small, watchful bird with a human face, perched at the entrance to the tomb or hovering above the wrapped body of the deceased. The bar was mobile in a way the car was not. During the day, the bar could leave the tomb and move freely through the world of the living, visiting places the deceased had loved, witnessing the continuation of life along the Nile, experiencing the sunlight that the dead body could no longer feel. But it had to return each night. The bar that failed to find its way back to the body before darkness fell was a bar in danger, separated from its anchor, unable to participate in the journey through the duat that each night required. Several spells in the Book of the Dead are written specifically to ensure the bar could find its way home, to protect the reunion between the bar and the body, to make certain that each morning the bar could depart, and each evening it could return, without losing itself in the complicated geography between the world of the living and the world of the dead. There was also the Akh. The Akh was the ultimate goal, the transformed, glorified state that the soul achieved if it successfully completed the journey through the duat and passed the judgment of the scales, where the K was vital energy and the bar was individual personality. The Akh was something more transcendent, the luminous, immortal self that existed beyond both. The word itself is related to the Egyptian word for light, and the Akh was often described as shining, radiant, possessed of a quality that set it apart from anything the living world contained. To become an Akh was to achieve what the Book of the Dead promised. It was the destination. The Akh joined the circumpolar stars, traveled with the sun, existed in the company of the gods in a state of permanent, unassailable blessedness. It was what every carefully prepared tomb, every precisely worded spell, every lovingly preserved body was working toward. But the Akh could only be achieved if the Ka and the Ba successfully reunited within the body. And if that unified soul then completed the journey through the underworld without being destroyed. Each component depended on the others. The system was interdependent in a way that made every element of the mortuary process feel urgent and necessary, because it was. Beyond these three primary components, Egyptian thought recognized additional elements of the human spiritual anatomy that appear throughout the Book of the Dead, with varying degrees of prominence. The Ren was the name, not merely as a label, but as a living, essential part of the person. The Egyptians believed that to speak a person's name was to keep something of them alive, to erase a name, to chisel it from a monument, to strike it from a papyrus, to ensure it was never spoken again, was a form of destruction as real as any physical harm. This is why the names of certain disgraced pharaohs were systematically removed from their monuments by successors who wished to condemn them to a kind of spiritual erasure. And it is why, conversely, The priests and family members of the dead continued to speak the names of those they had lost, in ritual, in prayer, in the simple act of remembering aloud. To say the name was to sustain the Ren. To sustain the Ren was to keep some part of the person present in the world. The Ib was the heart, and it occupied a position of absolutely central importance in Egyptian spiritual anatomy, because the heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, memory, and moral character. It was the record of a life. Everything a person had thought, felt, chosen, and done was written in the heart as surely as a scribe writes on papyrus. This is why, during mummification, the heart alone among the internal organs was left in the body rather than removed and stored in a canopic jar. Every other organ could be separated, preserved elsewhere, stored safely for the journey. The heart had to remain. It was needed. The scales of Ma'at waited for it. There was the shoot, the shadow, which the Egyptians regarded as a genuine part of a person's spiritual identity, real and significant in ways that are difficult to fully translate into modern conceptual language. And there was the Sa, the spiritual body, the idealized form of the physical self that the deceased would inhabit in the afterlife, perfected, freed from pain and decay and the ordinary indignities of mortal flesh. All of these components, taken together, constitute the Egyptian understanding of what a human being actually is. Not a body with a soul inside it, a layered, complex, interdependent assembly of spiritual elements, each one real, each one vulnerable, each one requiring its own form of protection and care. If the whole person was to survive the passage through death and emerge on the other side intact, the Book of the Dead was written for all of them. Every spell addressed some part of this intricate whole. Some protected the body, some guided the bar, some strengthened the ka, some ensured the name would be spoken, some prepared the heart for the moment it would be lifted from the chest and placed upon the golden scale, opposite the feather that weighed everything and forgave nothing. The Egyptians did not believe in a simple soul facing a simple judgment. They believed in a whole person, complicated, layered, luminous in potential, facing the most demanding passage imaginable, and they spent their entire civilization preparing for it. Every journey needs guides, and the journey the Egyptians imagined through the underworld was no different, except that the guides available to the dead soul were not human, were not mortal, and were not, by any ordinary measure, beings one would want to encounter unexpectedly in the dark. They were gods, ancient beyond reckoning, possessed of powers that operated outside the boundaries of natural law, each one presiding over a specific domain of the afterlife, with an authority so absolute that no spell, no argument, no appeal to higher mercy could override it. The Book of the Dead is populated by these figures on every page. They appear in its illustrated vignettes, painted in gold and lapis blue and the deep earthen red of Egyptian pigment, standing in their divine courts, holding their symbols of office, watching the soul approach with expressions that contain simultaneously both perfect compassion and perfect impartiality. They are not cruel, but they are not soft. They are the architecture of divine justice made flesh, and the soul that arrived before them unprepared arrived before them at its absolute peril. To understand the Book of the Dead fully is to understand these gods, not as symbols or metaphors, though they are certainly rich with symbolic meaning, but as the Egyptians understood them, as real presences with real histories, real relationships with one another, and real stakes in the outcome of every soul's judgment. At the center of everything stood Osiris. His story is the story the entire Egyptian afterlife tradition is built upon, a myth so ancient, so widely told, and so deeply embedded in Egyptian religious thought that its influence can be felt in virtually every chapter of the Book of the Dead. It is a story of death and resurrection, of betrayal and loyalty, of the power of love to accomplish what the laws of nature insist cannot be done. Osiris was, in the beginning, a king, not a god ruling from some remote celestial throne, but a king of Egypt itself, a ruler who walked among his people, who taught them agriculture and law and the arts of civilization, who was beloved with the particular ferocity that people reserve for those who genuinely improve their lives. He was married to Isis, whose intelligence and magical power were without equal among the gods, and he had a brother named Set. Set was everything Osiris was not, where Osiris brought order and fertility and the patient rhythms of agricultural life. Set was chaos, the desert, the storm, the violent red wind that scoured the land and left destruction in its wake. Set was not evil in the simple pantomime sense. Egyptian religion was rarely that clean, but Set wanted what Osiris had: the throne, the power, the love of the people, and he was willing to commit an act of such profound violation to obtain it that the gods themselves were shaken by it. He killed Osiris, murdered him, and then, to prevent any possibility of resurrection, he dismembered the body and scattered the pieces across Egypt. Some accounts say 14 pieces, some say 42, one for each region of the land, so that no part of the king could be reunited with any other. What followed was one of the great searches in all of world mythology. Isis, inconsolable, relentless, refused to accept what had been done. She traveled the length and breadth of Egypt, gathering the scattered pieces of her husband's body, reassembling him with a devotion that transcended grief and became something closer to an act of cosmic willpower. And when she had gathered all that could be found, some versions of the story say she could not recover every piece and fashioned a replacement from gold for what was missing. She used her extraordinary magical gifts to breathe life back into him. Osiris was resurrected, but he was not restored to the world of the living. He was something new now, the first of the resurrected dead, the prototype of every soul that would follow him through death and emerge on the other side transformed. He descended into the underworld and became its king, its judge, its presiding authority, and in doing so, he made it a place that the righteous dead could enter and survive, because Osiris himself had survived it. This is why the deceased in Egyptian mortuary texts was so frequently identified with Osiris, addressed as the Osiris of, followed by their name. To die was to become Osiris. To undertake the journey was to repeat his journey. To emerge blessed into the field of reeds was to share in his resurrection. The myth was not merely a story, it was a template, standing at the threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Present at every moment of transition was Anubis. He is perhaps the most immediately recognizable figure in all of Egyptian religious art. That lean, watchful form with the sleek black head of a jackal, depicted kneeling over the mummified body of the deceased, or standing at the entrance to the Hall of Two Truths where the heart was weighed. Black was not, in Egyptian symbolic thought, the color of death in the way it is in many Western traditions. It was the color of the rich Nile silt, the fertile black earth that made life possible, that received the seed and transformed it into sustenance. Black was the color of resurrection, of potential, of the darkness from which growth comes. Anubis was the god of embalming, of mummification, of the precise and sacred work of preparing the body for its eternal journey. The priests who performed mummification wore jackal masks in his honor, becoming him in the act of doing his work. He was present at the weighing of the heart. It was Anubis who guided the soul into the Hall of Two Truths, Anubis who steadied the scales, Anubis who announced the verdict. He was not a god of terror, though his domain was one that the living feared. He was a god of care. the careful, meticulous, deeply serious care that the dead required and deserved. There is a tenderness in the way Egyptian artists depicted him leaning over the body, his long hands attending to the work of preservation with a precision that spoke of genuine devotion to the task. He was the first face the dead soul saw. And in the logic of the Book of the Dead, that first encounter set the tone for everything that followed. To be received by Anubis was to be received with dignity. If Anubis was the guardian of the threshold, Thoth was the keeper of the record, depicted most commonly with the head of an ibis, that long-beaked contemplative bird, and carrying in his hands the tools of the scribe's trade, the palette, the reed brush, the papyrus scroll. Thoth was the god of writing, of wisdom, of measurement and calculation, and the precise ordering of knowledge. He was the divine scribe, the recorder of all things, the god who wrote down the verdict of the scales and ensured that the outcome was accurately preserved for eternity. In the Hall of Two Truths, while Anubis steadied the scales and Osiris presided from his throne and the 42 judges observed in silence, it was Thoth who stood to one side with his palette ready, watching the feather and the heart with the calm, complete attention of a being for whom accuracy was not merely professional, but cosmically essential. When the scales settled, when the judgment was made, Thoth recorded it. His record could not be appealed. His stylus did not make errors. Beyond his role in the judgment, Thoth occupied a position of unusual importance in Egyptian mythology that gave him a unique relationship to the Book of the Dead itself. He was credited, in many traditions, with the invention of writing, and therefore, by extension, with the invention of the magical texts that gave the dead their power. He was said to have assisted Isis in her search for the dismembered Osiris, to have provided the magical knowledge she needed to resurrect her husband. He was the divine intellect at the heart of the universe's operation, the God whose understanding encompassed everything that existed and everything that had ever been written about it. The scribes who composed and copied the Book of the Dead worked, in a very real sense, in his name. And then there was Ma'at. She was not, strictly speaking, a goddess in the way the others were gods, though she was depicted as one, a slender woman with a single ostrich feather in her hair, the feather that appeared on the opposite side of the scale from the heart. Ma'at was something more fundamental than a deity. She was a principle, the principle of truth, justice, harmony, and cosmic order. She was the right relationship of all things to all other things. She was the reason the sun rose each morning, and the Nile flooded each year, and the stars maintained their courses, and the crops grew, and the kingdom endured. To live according to Ma'at was to live rightly, not in a narrow religious sense, but in the broadest possible sense of being in correct relationship with the world and with other people. To have a heart lighter than her feather was to have lived a life in harmony with the deepest order of the universe. It was the highest thing the Egyptians could imagine, and it was the standard by which every soul, without exception, king or commoner, priest or farmer, was ultimately judged. There are moments in the history of human religious thought that stop you completely, not because they are strange or distant or impossible to relate to, but precisely because they are not. Because across the vast gulf of 4,000 years, across the difference of language and culture and cosmology, something in the idea reaches through all of that and finds you exactly where you are, and you recognize it with a directness that is almost uncomfortable. The weighing of the heart is one of those moments. It is the climax of the entire journey described in the Book of the Dead. Every spell that came before it, every password spoken at every gate, every serpent navigated, every corridor of fire survived, was preparation for this single scene. The soul had traveled through the 12 hours of the underworld night. It had spoken the correct words at every threshold. It had identified itself to every guardian, recited every required formula, navigated every hazard the Duat placed in its path. And now, at the end of all of that, it arrived at the place the Egyptians called the Hall of Two Truths, Maite Keru, the Hall of the Justified. And it stood before the thing it had been moving toward since the moment of death, the scale, the feather, the judge, and everything it had ever done in life. The Hall of Two Truths, as depicted in the great illustrated papyri of the New Kingdom, is one of the most extraordinary images in the history of art. Not extraordinary in the way that the Sistine Chapel ceiling is extraordinary, through the overwhelming force of technical mastery and sheer visual ambition, but extraordinary in the way that a very simple, very clear idea perfectly expressed is always extraordinary. There is an economy to the image, a precision. Everything in it is exactly where it needs to be, and means exactly what it is shown to mean. Osiris presides from a throne at the far end of the hall, sometimes shown beneath a canopy, wearing his characteristic white mummy-form wrappings and his distinctive double-plumed crown, holding the crook and the flail, the symbols of divine kingship, crossed against his chest. He is the final authority, the last word. Beside him and behind him stand Isis and her sister Nephthys, their arms extended in the eternal gesture of divine protection. Along the walls of the hall, seated in rows, are the 42 assessors, the divine judges, one for each of Egypt's regions, each one responsible for evaluating whether the deceased has committed the specific transgression they govern. They are watchful and still. They have been doing this since the beginning of time. They will do it long after this particular soul has passed through and received its verdict. In the center of the hall stands the great scale, a balance beam of divine gold, suspended on a pivot, perfectly calibrated for the task it was built to perform, and has performed for every soul that has ever died. On one side of the scale hangs the heart, the ibi, removed from the chest of the deceased, containing within it the complete and unedited record of everything they were. On the other side rests the feather of Ma'at, that single white ostrich plume, so light it barely registers, so significant it outweighs empires. Anubis kneels beside the scale, one hand on the beam, watching the measurement with absolute concentration. Thoth stands nearby with his palette and his reed brush, ready to record what the scale reveals. And somewhere very close enough that its shadow falls across the proceedings, is Ammit. Ammit deserves a particular kind of attention. She is not celebrated the way Osiris and Anubis and Thoth are celebrated. She does not appear on jewelry or amulets or the decorative objects that ancient Egyptians wore as expressions of devotion. No temple was dedicated to her. No hymn praised her name. And yet she is present at every judgment, waiting with the patient, terrible stillness of a creature that has never gone hungry. Because there has never been a shortage of heavy hearts, the Egyptians depicted her as a composite animal, the front half of a lion or leopard, the hind quarters of a hippopotamus, and the head of a crocodile. Each of these animals was, in Egyptian understanding, among the most dangerous things that existed in the natural world. The crocodile lurked beneath the surface of the Nile and took the unwary without warning. The hippopotamus could overturn a boat with a casual movement of its body. The lion was the apex predator of the desert margins. Ammit combined all three into a single being whose entire existence was oriented toward one purpose. She waited for the hearts that were too heavy, and when a heart failed the scale, when it came down weighted with cruelty, with dishonesty, with the accumulated evidence of a life lived in violation of Ma'at, Ammit moved. She consumed the heart, and in consuming it, she destroyed the soul entirely. Not punished, not sent to some Egyptian equivalent of hell to suffer and eventually be redeemed, simply gone, erased from existence with a completeness that left nothing behind. The Egyptians called this the second death, and they regarded it as the most terrible outcome imaginable. more terrible than any punishment, because punishment implies continuation. The second death implied nothing at all. Before the weighing itself, the soul was required to perform an act of declaration that Egyptologists call the negative confession, though that translation, precise as it is, perhaps undersells the dramatic weight of what was actually happening in the hall. The deceased stood before the 42 divine judges and addressed each one in turn. To each assessor, they declared that they had not committed the specific transgression that assessor governed. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not murdered. I have not caused another to weep. I have not acted with arrogance. I have not coveted what belonged to others. I have not corrupted the flow of water. I have not been deaf to words of truth. The full list runs to 42 declarations, one for each judge, each one naming a different category of moral failure. Reading through them in sequence is a quietly revelatory experience, because the picture of human virtue they assemble is not the narrow, rule-bound virtue of a legal code. It is something richer and more humanistic than that. It encompasses not only the great obvious violations, murder, theft, assault, but subtler failures, gossip, arrogance, the pollution of natural resources, the mistreatment of animals, the exploitation of the poor, the corruption of legitimate weights and measures in the marketplace. The Egyptians cared about all of it. The divine judges kept a record of all of it, and the heart that carried the weight of even the smaller, less dramatic cruelties could find itself heavier than expected when the scale settled. Now, and this is where the Book of the Dead enters the scene, in a way that has fascinated and occasionally disturbed modern scholars. The text contains spells specifically designed to influence this moment. Chapter 30 of the Book of the Dead, addressed directly to the heart, reads in essence as an instruction to the heart not to testify against its owner, to remain silent before the judges, to not reveal what it knew. O my heart of my mother, O my heart of my different forms, do not stand up against me as a witness. Do not be opposed to me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the scales. This has prompted considerable scholarly debate, and it is worth sitting with the question it raises honestly. Was the Book of the Dead, this elaborate moral document, with its detailed catalogue of virtues and its vision of perfect cosmic justice, also, at the same time, a system for gaming the very judgment it described? Were the Egyptians, with their characteristic layered complexity, building a loophole into the architecture of divine accountability? Some scholars argue yes, that the spells represent exactly what they appear to represent, an attempt to use magical power to suppress the evidence of a less than virtuous life, to arrive at the scales better armed than the true condition of the heart might warrant. Others argue that the relationship between the negative confession, the heart spell, and the weighing itself is more nuanced than that the spell was not intended to suppress genuine moral failure, but to protect the soul from the distortions that fear and the trauma of death itself might introduce. That a good heart, in the extremity of the judgment, might tremble and misrepresent itself, and the spell was a steadying hand rather than a cover-up. The truth, as with so much in the Egyptian tradition, is probably not fully recoverable from this distance. What we can say is that the Egyptians were not naive about human imperfection. They did not design a moral system for beings who never failed. They designed one for people. Complicated, contradictory, capable of both great generosity and quiet cruelty, the same as people have always been. And perhaps what the heart spell reveals, more than anything else, is that even the most devout and careful Egyptian knew that when the moment came and the scale was balanced, and every word ever spoken and every act ever committed was laid bare in the most unforgiving light imaginable, they would want, more than anything, just a little help. That is not a failure of the moral vision. That is the moral vision being honest about who it was written for. When the scale settled, when the heart was found lighter than the feather, when Thoth recorded the verdict and Anubis confirmed it, and Osiris pronounced the soul justified, What happened next was not merely relief, it was transformation. The soul that had passed the judgment became something it had never been before. It stepped out of the hall of two truths and into the light of the field of reeds, and it carried with it a new name, Mayet Keru, the justified one, the true of voice, a name that meant the journey was over, and the eternal life had begun. We have spent considerable time in the dark, moving through the 12 hours of the underworld night, navigating gates and guardians, watching the scales settle and Amit wait in the shadows beside it. The Book of the Dead is, in many of its chapters, a document of danger, a manual for surviving a journey that could, at any moment, go catastrophically wrong. It is easy, reading through its spells and its warnings and its elaborate protocols for addressing monstrous gatekeepers by their secret names, to forget that all of that darkness was in service of something. It was in service of light, of arrival, of a destination the Egyptians imagined with such specificity, such warmth, and such evident longing that reading their descriptions of it feels less like studying an ancient religious text and more like reading a letter from someone describing a place they love and want you to understand you are going to love too. The field of reeds, Aru in Egyptian, was paradise. But not paradise as an abstraction, not a vague, luminous realm of undefined bliss. Paradise as a place, a specific, detailed, geographically coherent place, with regions and rivers and crops and light, conceived by people who understood the difference between a life that was good and a life that was not, and who built their vision of eternity from the finest materials their living experience had given them. The most immediate thing to understand about the field of reeds is that it was, in its fundamental character, Egypt, not a transcendent realm beyond all earthly reference, not a purely spiritual state existing outside the physical world. It was an idealized, perfected, permanently sustained version of the land the Egyptians actually lived in, the same landscape they had walked and farmed and sailed and loved, stripped of everything that made that landscape difficult and dangerous and finite, and preserved in a state of permanent abundance and beauty. There was the Nile. Of course there was the Nile, because for the Egyptians, the Nile was not merely a geographical feature. It was the condition of life itself. A world without the Nile was not a world the Egyptian imagination could recognize as worth inhabiting. In the field of reeds, the river ran wide and clear and eternally full. It did not flood unpredictably. It did not dry in seasons of drought. It simply flowed, steady and generous, as the Egyptians had always wanted it to flow, and had spent their entire civilization learning to manage when it did not. The fields themselves, as the name suggests, were defined by their extraordinary fertility. The grain that grew in the field of reeds grew taller than any earthly grain. The harvest was inexhaustible. The Egyptians, who understood hunger in a way that agricultural civilizations always do, who knew that the difference between a good flood and a bad one was the difference between eating and not eating, built into their paradise the one thing they could never fully guarantee in life: enough. More than enough. The permanent, unambiguous sufficiency of a land where the earth never failed. There were fruit trees heavy with their loads. There were vegetables in their season, except that in the field of reeds there was no season, or rather, every season was harvest season. Every day was the right day to eat. Every reach of the hand toward a branch produced exactly what the reaching hand wanted to find. The illustrated papyri of the New Kingdom show us these fields with a directness and a warmth that the grimmer sections of the Book of the Dead rarely achieve. The vignettes depicting the field of reeds have a quality that is almost pastoral. Small, careful paintings of the deceased at work in golden fields, or sailing on luminous water in a slim papyrus boat, or simply standing in the abundance of it all, with an expression that Egyptian artists, constrained by the formal conventions of their tradition, could only gesture toward, but that is nonetheless unmistakable. Contentment. The particular, earned contentment of someone who has arrived somewhere they have been traveling toward for a very long time. The deceased in these images is often shown performing agricultural work, plowing, sowing, harvesting, and this detail is worth pausing on because to a modern eye it might seem an odd feature of paradise. Labor. The requirement to work, surely an eternal reward, would involve freedom from the very tasks that defined and exhausted mortal life. The Egyptian understanding of this was more nuanced. Work in the field of reeds was not the punishing, uncertain labor of mortal agriculture. The labor performed in anxiety about whether the harvest would be sufficient, whether the flood would come, whether the soil was good enough, whether there would be enough to eat before the next growing season arrived. Work in the field of reeds was work from which all of that anxiety had been removed. What remained was the activity itself, the plowing, the planting, the harvesting, experienced purely, without the weight of necessity pressing down on it. It was work as expression rather than survival. Work as participation in the eternal fertility of a world that would never fail, and for a civilization built entirely on the cultivation of the Nile Valley, for people whose identity, whose calendar, whose ritual life, whose very concept of cosmic order was organized around the agricultural cycle. That kind of work was not a burden. It was a form of meaning. The Egyptians, however, were also practical people, and they understood that even in paradise, the requirement to plow and sow and harvest might, on certain days, feel less like joyful expression and more like work. They solved this problem with characteristic ingenuity. Among the objects placed in Egyptian tombs from the Middle Kingdom onward were small figurines called ushabti, sometimes spelled shabti, typically made from faience, wood, stone or clay, in the mummiform shape of a wrapped figure ready for burial. These figurines were inscribed with a specific spell, Chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead, that activated them in the afterlife whenever the deceased was called upon to perform agricultural labor. The spell, spoken by the ushabti, was essentially a declaration of willingness to substitute for the deceased. If I am called upon, if I am counted to do any work that is to be done in the realm of the dead, to cultivate the fields, to irrigate the banks, to carry sand, look, I am here, I will do it. The ushabti would answer the call. The deceased could rest. Some wealthy Egyptians were buried with 365 ushabti, one for every day of the year, plus an additional 36 overseer figurines, one for every 10 workers, holding tiny whips to keep the workforce organized. The Egyptians were building a complete labor management system for the afterlife, because they were Egyptians, and they understood that even paradise runs better with proper administration. There is something simultaneously amusing and deeply touching about this. The image of a wealthy official in the field of reeds, surrounded by his small clay workforce, delegating the cosmic agricultural labor while he sits by the eternal river. It is so recognizably human, so continuous with the concerns and habits of mortal life, that it closes the distance of 4,000 years in a single breath. The light of the field of reeds deserves its own consideration, because it appears in the text repeatedly and always with a specific quality that distinguishes it from ordinary sunlight. It was not the harsh, bleaching light of the Egyptian desert, the light that cracked mud and faded pigment and drove people into shade at midday. It was softer than that, more diffuse. The texts describe it as the light of the sun in its perfected form, Ra, at his most benevolent, his rays reaching the field of reeds without the brutality that accompanied them in the mortal world. It was light that warmed without burning, that illuminated without blinding, that made everything it touched visible and beautiful without diminishing anything. It was, in short, the light you see in the very best hours of an Egyptian day, the light of early morning or late afternoon, when the Nile catches the sun at an angle and the whole world along its banks turns gold, extended eternally, without the heat of noon or the darkness of night ever interrupting it. The Egyptians knew beautiful light. They lived under extraordinary skies, and they loved the good hours of their days enough to build a paradise in which those hours never ended. What strikes the careful reader of these descriptions, what accumulates slowly and then arrives with some force, is the essential conservatism of the Egyptian paradise. Not conservatism in a political sense, but in the root sense of the word, the desire to conserve, to keep, to hold on to what was good and prevent it from being lost. The field of reeds was not a transformation into something unrecognizable. It was a continuation, a preservation of the best of what earthly life had been, freed from its worst. The same river, the same fields, the same work, drained of its anxiety, the same light, freed from its harshness, the same person, freed from the body's decay but recognizably, essentially, themselves. The Book of the Dead was not, at its deepest level, a guide to becoming something else. It was a guide to remaining yourself, forever and without loss. There is an idea that runs beneath the entire surface of the Book of the Dead, like a current beneath still water. An idea so fundamental to the Egyptian worldview that it rarely needs to be stated explicitly, because it is assumed on every page, in every chapter, in every carefully formed hieroglyph pressed into papyrus by a scribe who understood exactly what he was doing. The idea is this: words have power, not metaphorical power, not the power of inspiration or persuasion, or the gentle influence that a well-chosen phrase can have on a receptive mind. Literal, operational, physical power. The power to open doors that no hand could push. The power to still serpents that no weapon could kill. The power to transform, protect, command, and create. Because in the Egyptian understanding of the universe, language was not a human invention layered on top of reality. Language was the mechanism by which reality itself had been assembled. When the god Ptah, the great creator deity of Memphis, made the world, he did not shape it with his hands. He spoke it into existence. The words came first, the world followed. And if words had been sufficient to bring the entire universe into being, then the right words, spoken with knowledge and authority and correct intention, were sufficient to do almost anything. The Book of the Dead was the most concentrated repository of those right words that Egyptian civilization ever produced. The spells it contained ranged across an extraordinary spectrum of concern, from the cosmically significant to the arrestingly specific, from the sublime to the genuinely peculiar, and it is in the full range of that spectrum, considered together, that the texture of Egyptian belief reveals itself most honestly. Some spells were grand. Chapter 125, the chapter of the weighing of the heart, the negative confession, the judgment before Osiris, is among the most formally magnificent pieces of religious literature produced by any culture in the ancient world. It has the weight and the cadence of a text that knew it was important, that was written with an awareness of the enormous stakes attached to the moment it described. Reading it, even in translation, you feel the architecture of it, the way it builds, declaration by declaration, toward the stillness at the center where the scale settles and everything is decided. But then there was chapter 162, which contained a spell to keep the deceased warm in the afterlife. A spell for warmth. The practicality of that, the intimacy of it, is startling in the best possible way. Whoever composed that chapter understood that paradise, however luminous and abundant, might still have cold nights, that the soul, whatever its transformed nature, might still carry within it the memory of being cold and the desire not to be. They wrote a spell for it. They included it in the guide. They made sure the dead would be warm. There was a spell to prevent the deceased from having to walk upside down in the underworld. A fate apparently considered both undignified and genuinely dangerous. There was a spell to ensure the soul could take whatever form it wished, to become a falcon, or a lotus flower, or a swallow, or a serpent, or a crocodile, or even a divine being of pure light, moving through the duat in whatever shape offered the best advantage at any particular moment. Shapeshifting was not merely a magical novelty in the Egyptian conception, it was a survival strategy. The soul that could become a falcon could fly above dangers that would overwhelm it on the ground. The soul that could become a crocodile could cross rivers that would drown it in any other form. There was a spell. Chapter 153, specifically designed to protect the soul from being caught in a fisherman's net in the underworld. The details of this spell reveal something fascinating about the Egyptian cosmological imagination. The dua was understood to contain rivers and lakes, and those rivers and lakes contained fishermen, and those fishermen cast nets, and souls could be caught in those nets if they were not protected against it. The underworld was not a realm of pure abstraction. It was as concretely populated, as practically dangerous as the living world, just populated and dangerous in its own specific ways. Among the most important and most frequently included spells were those concerning transformation, the ability of the soul to assume different forms at will. These spells are some of the oldest material in the entire tradition, with roots reaching back through the coffin texts all the way to the pyramid texts themselves. They were considered essential because the dua was a realm in which fixed form was vulnerability. The soul that was locked into a single shape was a soul that could be cornered, trapped, threatened, and destroyed. The spell to become a lotus flower, one of the most beautiful in the collection, transformed the soul into the blue lotus of the Nile, the flower that closed at night and opened again at dawn, that the Egyptians associated with the sun's daily resurrection and with the emergence of creation itself from the primordial waters. To become the lotus was to participate directly in the cycle of renewal, to embody rather than merely witness the daily miracle of light returning after darkness. The spell to become a swallow allowed the soul to move through the underworld with the speed and agility of a bird that the Egyptians observed navigating even the most turbulent winds with effortless grace. The swallow was a bird of good omen. Its arrival announced the coming of the flood, the return of abundance. To wear its form in the duat was to carry that omen into the underworld itself. The spell to become a divine falcon identified with Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis, the god who had avenged his father's murder and restored order to a world Set had broken, was perhaps the most powerful of all the transformation spells. To become Horus was to take on the aspect of divine kingship, of the victorious sun rising above the horizon, of everything that had conquered chaos and death and emerged triumphant into the light. No gate could hold back a soul wearing the shape of Horus. No guardian could deny passage to the god who had already defeated death. The spells that protected the body, working in concert with the physical preservation of mummification, form another essential category within the Book of the Dead. Chapter 40. 3 prevented the decapitation of the deceased in the underworld. Chapter 42 protected each individual part of the body by identifying it with a specific god. The hair with Nu, the face with Ra, the eyes with Hathor, the ears with Thoth, the lips with Anubis, the teeth with Serket. Every part of the physical form was placed under divine protection by being named as the property of a deity whose power guaranteed its preservation. This spell is remarkable for what it reveals about the Egyptian understanding of the body's continued importance even after death. The soul needed the body. The car needed its anchor. The bar needed its home. The elaborate transformations of the duat, the shape-shifting, the flying, the navigating of rivers and gates were ultimately in service of a return. The soul would come back. It had to come back. and it needed something to come back to protect the body part by part, by placing each piece under the guardianship of a specific god, was to make the entire physical form sacred, to insist that even in death, even wrapped in linen and lying in the dark of a sealed tomb, the body mattered, was worth protecting, was the legitimate dwelling place of something eternal and irreplaceable. And then there were the spells of the heart, spells that addressed not the body, not the external dangers of the duat, but the interior life of the soul itself, the fears that a soul might carry into death, the memories that might weigh on it, the grief of leaving, the terror of the unknown that waited even for the most carefully prepared traveler. These spells are the quietest in the collection, the least dramatic. They do not describe serpents or gates or scales or monstrous guardians. They describe the inside of a human being facing the largest transition imaginable. And they offer, in their careful, ancient language, something that no amount of magical protection against physical dangers could provide. They offer comfort, the assurance that the journey, however long and dark and difficult, had an end, that the end was good, that the soul making the crossing was not making it alone, that the gods who had designed a passage had also, in their wisdom and their care, left instructions for surviving it, that the words written on the scroll, carried into the tomb, placed beside the body of someone loved, those words worked. They had always worked. They would continue to work. For 1,500 years, the Egyptians trusted in that. They rolled their scrolls with care. They sealed their tombs. They whispered the names of their dead. They placed ushabti in neat rows and wrote spells on linen and buried blue faience amulets shaped like hearts and scarabs in the open eye of Horus. They did everything they knew how to do, because love, in the face of death, always tries everything it knows, and some part of that, the trying, the refusing to simply let go without a fight, the insistence that the right words exist and can be found and will be enough, is not ancient at all. It is the most human thing there is.